I had the Nikon Z6 III for testing for a few days and scrutinized it with several thousand photos taken. So in this video, we will see whether or not the Nikon Z6 III is a sufficiently capable camera for wildlife photography, and I can already tell you that there is a lot to discuss about it. So we will closely examine the image quality, ergonomics, field use, ISO performance, autofocus capabilities, available features, and everything you need to know for wildlife photography. So before we start, 3 important things to consider. The first is that I had a pre-production model for 48 hours and not a final version. Secondly, I will not cover the technical specifications of the device because I have already discussed them in the announcement video, which you can find in the description. And thirdly, I will only talk about wildlife photography in this video, so I will not cover the specifics for other fields or for video for the same reasons. Alright, let's get started right away with the general ergonomics, and this Nikon is very pleasant to use and fits well in the hands. In terms of size, it's a bit larger than the Z6 II and a bit smaller than the Nikon Z8. I think it's a good balance between the two. The body looks very durable. According to Nikon, it has the same level of construction as the Nikon Z8. Paired with a 180-600mm, it's a pleasant duo to use because the whole setup is light and perfectly balanced. I also tested it with my 400mm 2.8 TC, and although the balance is naturally less optimal, it still remains a relatively easy setup to use handheld. I would have liked to have a grip available during this test to rebalance it a bit with this lens, and I think it would feel exactly the same with, for example, a 600mm f4. The device, however, does not lack buttons, as there are 2 custom buttons on the front and many options on the back. I particularly appreciated that the playback button is positioned on the right, which avoids having to let go of the telephoto lens with the left hand. Features the same vari-angle screen as the Nikon ZF, allowing you to position it as you like and even flip it around for filming yourself. Personally, I am a huge fan of the screen on the Z9, which I find much more robust and practical for aligning with the lens axis, but it remains a very pleasant screen to use that will especially delight videographers. However, where I was really impressed was with the quality of the viewfinder, which is simply the most pleasant I've tested, and I would absolutely love to have the same one on my Nikon Z9. The screen in the viewfinder is very bright and the color rendering is simply stunning thanks to the new DCI-P3. This is a great asset in the field, especially in low light conditions, which is very often the case in wildlife photography. Alright, let's go straight to the computer to see some photographs taken with this Nikon Z6 III. Before we start, I want to clarify that all the photographs you are about to see were taken with the Nikon Z180 600mm. So in terms of image quality, as I mentioned, this Nikon Z6 has a 24 megapixel sensor. Now, there are many photographers who are disappointed with this resolution because they feel it's not enough. Personally, I've never really been bothered by lower resolutions. I find that 24 million pixels is more than enough, and if I zoom in on this image, you can see that we still have very high image quality with a lot of detail and honesty in the image. So personally, it's not something that bothers me. Of course, in situations where the subjects are a bit further away and smaller in the image, you will naturally have fewer possibilities to crop your photograph. But you can still see that if I make a significant crop of my photo on this hero, you'll notice that even when zooming in a bit on the image, we still maintain good image quality, even with a 24 megapixel sensor. I'll show you another example with this marmot taken at 3200 ISO. You'll see that even when I zoom into the image, we still have a very beautiful image quality with excellent sharpness. Regarding the ISO performance, you can see that at 3200 ISO, it remains very clean. The advantage of having a small sensor with a modest resolution of 24 million pixels is that it allows for better ISO performance, which is really very efficient. Personally, I find it very good up to 6400 ISO. It is very usable. After that, of course, if you are shooting at 2800 ISO or higher, you will definitely need to rework the photographs. We will see this especially with other photos that were taken at higher ISO sensitivities. In any case, you can see the color quality that has made Nikon famous. Look here, I am using the neutral camera profile and we already have very beautiful color management. This is a major strength of Nikon. The color is really very beautiful. Of course, people either like or dislike Nikon's colors, but personally, I find that the files are really very pleasant to look at and to rework in post-processing. I'll also show you the work on some photographs. For example, with this one that was a bit underexposed right from the shot, you'll see that we have a very good range for exposure correction. We will be able to easily rework our photographs in Lightroom or another software. It is really very pleasant to work on Nikon files. I'll show you a little zoom to appreciate the quality. Even though we're working with a 24 megapixel sensor, you can see here that the details are well preserved. I'll show you another example with this photograph. You will see that in terms of editing range, we will have the possibility to take photographs that will be overexposed. For example, if I come here to rework my photograph like this, you see that I can get a very bright result, or on the contrary, if I reset my photograph, I can work on much darker things. For example, working on a low key, which allows me to rework my photography like this. For example, I could rework the shadows here and darken the blacks, and I could also go back back and rework my background to darken it completely. So I will select a background mask here, and I am going to decrease the exposure of my background to really work on a low key effect. So a working range that is super interesting, allowing you to recover a lot of details and rework your photos if needed in Lightroom. In terms of shadow recovery, it's also very good. You will see this especially in this graph, which was taken at 1600 ISO. If I slightly overexpose my image and bring out the duck's head by increasing the shadows here, you can see that the digital noise is quite well managed. The advantage of using a lower resolution is that it allows us to recover a lot of details in the shadows and blacks without creating too much digital noise in our photo. Now, I'll show you an example that was taken at 2800 ISO very early in the morning with not much light. So if I zoom in on the image, you can see that we still retain quite a lot of detail on the subject. Of course, we start to see some degradation of the photograph, but in my opinion, it remains very much usable. In the background, in the dark areas, you can notice some noise, but it's still quite controlled. And personally, I find these photographs to be completely usable. I also show you a before and after with Lightroom's AI-based noise reduction, and you can see that the result is very, very good. We retain a lot of detail on the subject, and most importantly, the digital noise is significantly reduced, especially in the dark areas where there is much less digital noise. To finish, I will show you 3 more examples taken with the Nikon Z6 III, focusing on the background and foreground. If I zoom in on the image, you can see that we have very beautiful sharpness of the subject. If we are on very close-ups, I will zoom into the photograph. You can see here that we also have a lot of quality and a lot of details in the image, even though we are using a 24 megapixel sensor. And to finish, a little duck. If I zoom in as well, you can see that we get very beautiful image quality and a lot of detail in the feathers. Regarding the rolling shutter, I show you a burst that was taken at 20 frames per second in RAW format. So you can see that in terms of rolling shutter, there is absolutely none at all. The big advantage of having a semi-stacked sensor is that you will have very little rolling shutter effect in fast scenes. So obviously it won't be at the level of a Nikon Z8 or a Nikon Z9, but among non-stacked sensors, it will clearly have one of the best rolling shutters. So maybe here we might have some slight distortions, but personally I didn't really notice any, and it didn't bother me in all the photographs I took with the Nikon Z6 III. Alright, let's talk about the autofocus now, and there's a lot to say about it, so we'll break it down into several points. The first one will be animal detection, including mammals, dogs, and cats. On this point, there's really nothing to complain about. It's very, very good compared to a Z6 III. It's simply night and day because the autofocus locks onto subjects very well. I was able to test it on 2 marmots fighting, which is a very fast action, and you can see that the autofocus tracks the animal's movements well. I also tried to challenge it by playing with the limit of foreground blur, and I was surprised to see that the autofocus kept the focus on the eye even with a slight haze in front of the subject. So there can be some hesitations in certain complicated situations, which can mostly be resolved with good settings and proper use of the autofocus. But personally, I never really felt in trouble, and it felt like I had a Nikon Z8 in my hands when it came to animal autofocus. However, I did not test it at all on humans or vehicles, but according to tests from other YouTubers, it is excellent in these areas as well. It's great to see that Nikon has successfully transferred the autofocus from the Z8 and Z9 to its mid-range model and has finally caught up with the competition. But the very, very strong point of this autofocus is its ability to focus down to -10 EV, which is much more than the competition and even more than the Nikon Z8 or the Nikon Z9, which are much more expensive. So clearly, if you enjoy wildlife photography early in the morning or late in the evening, this is a very interesting camera because in addition to its good ISO performance, it will allow you to focus almost in the dark, making this camera very appealing for wildlife photography. Regarding the buffer, since we have a 24 megapixel sensor, it certainly helps, and even in RAW the buffer is almost unlimited, which is a very, very good point for wildlife photography. Alright, let's move on to bird detection. For your information, the Nikon Z6 III does not have a dedicated bird mode like the Nikon Z8 or the Nikon Z9. So Nikon told me that this should come with a future firmware update, but without any guarantees, so for now we have to make do with the standard animal detection, even for birds. And in this field we will have some very good and less good results because the outcomes will greatly depend on the situation. If the bird doesn't move too much, then there's no problem. The autofocus can detect it regardless of the situation, and even if there are many distracting elements around the subject, it will work more or less the same as with mammals. Regarding birds in flight, the same observation applies. It works very well if the bird is against the sky, no problem. The autofocus locks on perfectly. However, there have been several tests where people complained that the autofocus struggled to detect the bird if it was very small in the image or against a cluttered background. Personally, I didn't have that impression as much. I'll show you an example with this stork that was really far away, hidden in the trees, and you can see that the autofocus had no trouble detecting the bird. Afterwards, yes, I also had a few situations where the autofocus hesitated or lost the subject, but that was really when it was very far away or with a very cluttered background. But personally, I don't even take those kinds of photos, so I don't find it bothersome for my practice. price. Obviously, the dedicated bird mode would make a clear difference in this kind of situation. I had already shown it when this mode was released in an earlier video, so I really hope it will be added to the Nikon Z6 III through a future firmware update. However, where I really had quite a few issues was when the bird was perched and about to take off very quickly, as you can see in these videos. In fact, in this kind of situation, I feel like the autofocus struggles to be sufficiently responsive and often stays stuck on the initial position as if there is a delay before the autofocus adapts. So, there are settings in the menus that can improve this, which I discuss in my courses dedicated to Nikon cameras, but even with these settings, I have to admit that it was really a problem, and I had a lot of trouble following the subjects at the beginning of the action. Then I noticed that it also depended a lot on the size of the bird, because with larger specimens, the autofocus was much better at locking onto the subject. It was mainly with small birds that it struggled to analyze the scene and adapt to takeoff, which brings us back to the difference with the bird mode on the Nikon Z8 and Z9 that could really solve this kind of situation, I think. Let's move on to the other negative points, because yes, of course, there are some. No camera is perfect. Firstly, the sensor protection, which was not added. Clearly, at this price point, it's a big mistake on Nikon's part. Secondly, the pre-burst is still not in RAW, though it works well. I struggle to understand why Nikon sticks to JPEG, and I have the impression that this is not going to change anytime soon. Thirdly, the price, as it is under the 3,000 euro mark, is still over 800 euro higher than its predecessor, the Nikon Z6 II, which is a significant increase that Nikon justifies with the introduction of its semi-stacked sensor. We could also talk about the burst rate, which is only 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Personally, I find that more than sufficient, but many people think it's not enough compared to the competition, which can do 30 or 40 frames per second. And if dynamic range is important to you, per some tests it might be below other models. It's up to you to decide based on your practice. In short, in the end, I think you get it, but the Nikon Z6 III is, in my opinion, a very good camera that has the advantage of being very versatile, and it's clearly a body that should have been released several years ago to compete much earlier with the Canon R6 II and the Sony A7R4. In any case, I am super happy to see that Nikon has caught up in the mid-range segment, and compared to the Z6 II, we are clearly in a different world. So yes, it has flaws for some very specific things, as we saw just before, but I really hope that Nikon will quickly release an update that will bring the specific bird detection from the Z8, Z9, which would make this Z6 III almost flawless in the mid-range. And that's not even mentioning the video capabilities, which I am deliberately not covering today, but which also offer very strong arguments for videographers and are unanimously considered by all testers as the major strength of this camera compared to the competition. So in the end, who is the Z6 III for and who do I recommend it to? It's simple. If you currently have a Nikon Z6 II and are not satisfied with the autofocus, then you can go for the Z6 III with your eyes closed. As I said, it's like night and day in terms of subject detection, and you can't go wrong because it's the best value for money for wildlife photography at Nikon. And I also think about those who have stuck with DSLRs waiting for a mid-range camera with excellent autofocus. This is probably the camera you've been waiting for over the past few years. However, if you need a much higher resolution and you want to photograph birds taking off or landing right now, then maybe the Nikon Z8 would be better for you with its dedicated bird mode, even though we all hope to see it come to the Z6 III as well. In any case, I had a great time testing it. It's a very nice camera to use with excellent ISO performance and an autofocus that truly stands out. And I really felt like I had a little Nikon Z8 in my hands. I'm seriously considering getting one as a secondary camera to the Z9, especially for its low light capabilities and to have a lighter option. If you have any questions about this Nikon Z6 III, share them in the comments. I am curious to read your opinion on this camera for wildlife photography. Finally, if you would like to improve in wildlife photography and bring much more creativity to your images, I invite you to download my 3 free PDF guides that have just appeared on the screen, in which I reveal many techniques that have allowed me to win several photo contests. And if you want to learn how to take much sharper photos, I recommend watching the next video, which is right here. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this episode until the end. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon for a new video. Bye YouTube.